Hello guys, today we're going to be talking about the Korean War. So we're going to be continuing over the next couple of weeks to talk about what's going on with the Cold War. And our focus now is going to shift to looking at how the Cold War becomes a hot war. How are ways in which the developments of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, between communism and democracy, how do those things actually turn into actual wars? And the Korean War is an example of that we are going to have fighting happening on the peninsula of Korea, and it's going to be directly related to the issues of the Cold War. And eventually, we're going to have a divided Korea that's going to be fighting North versus South, and each side is going to be supported by either the Soviet Union or the United States. So, the purpose of today is to give you an introduction, a really brief, I hope, introduction to the background on what was going on in Korea prior to the war. And the second part of today's assignment is going to look at why the United States ultimately decided to get involved. So, what was compelling the United States to support the South Koreans in the Korean War and send soldiers and troops and weapons into and actually fight in a war? So you should have the notes outline for this downloaded and following along. And then, like I said, there's going to be a second piece to this that I will explain really briefly once we're done here with the notes. So, kind of some background information. If we go all the way pre-World War II, Korea, the peninsula of Korea, had been ruled by Japan. So, if you remember, we talked about World War II. Japan had increased its territorial holdings over a lot of places in Asia. One of those places it took control over was Korea. So, from 1910 to 1945, Japan had controlled Korea. But when the war was over and Japan lost the war, the decision was to divide Korea in half. So if you've noticed, there's a pattern here. We're seeing a lot of countries that are in contention being divided with the ultimate goal that they would be reunited. Now, in Germany, that didn't happen. Germany was divided into a West Germany and an East Germany, and it remained an East and West Germany all the way through until the late 1980s, early 1990s. Korea, we're going to see the same goal here. We're going to divide the northern part of Korea into a zone that's going to be occupied by the Soviet Union. The southern part of Korea will be occupied by the United States. You can see it's divided at what we call the 38th parallel line, the latitude line that's dividing north and south. And the goal was that each side would help those countries or those sides of Korea rebuild, and then eventually they would be reunited under one government. So the goal was to give Korea its independence eventually after each side had been stabilized. I think most of us know today that that never happens. They're never reunified, and we still have a North Korea and a South Korea today. So these two countries will never be, or these two sections of the country will never be reunited. So North Korea then is, because it was controlled by the Soviet Union, it comes under the control of a communist government, and the leader is Kim Il Sung. So Kim Il Sung essentially was supported by the Soviet Union and placed as the dictator of North Korea. South Korea is led by a man named Syngman Rhee, and he is the president of the Republic of Korea, which is a democratic country that was backed by the United States. So, again, communism in the north, democracy, capitalism in the south. Now, South Korea doesn't do particularly well after World War II. It is unstable politically. They have not ruled themselves in decades. And so, all of a sudden, going to a free, democratically elected government is not an easy thing to do. And so, the United States is worried that if the U.S. pulls its troops out of South Korea, they're worried that South Korea would fall to communism, that the North would invade, would take it over, and the entire Korean peninsula would become communist. And so we don't want that to happen. Remember, we've got policies of containment. We don't want communism to spread to new places, and we don't want communism to spread to South Korea. So the U.S. government is going to help build up the South Korean army and try to stabilize the government as much as possible, prepare them in case there is ever an invasion, and then both the US and the Soviet armies remove their military from Korea in 1949. So that was what they had pledged, is that they would stabilize those countries and then they would leave, and that's what they did. And the US now is just hoping that South Korea will be able to maintain its independence and remain a democratic country in the face of a communist North Korea. At the same time, we're seeing communism expand into other places, and it expands into one key place near Korea, which is in China. So after World War II, remember China had also been taken over by Japan and had fought during World War II. After the war, the government was headed by a man named Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist, and he is challenged by a communist leader, Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong will launch a civil war against Chiang Kai-shek to take control of the government. And by 1949, he is successful. Mao Zedong is successful in that attack, and the communists will take over the government in China. And the Nationalist Party was forced off of the mainland into Taiwan. So now we've got more countries becoming communist. Communism is spreading, and so it's not just in the Soviet Union, it's spread into Eastern Europe. Now it's spread into China as well as North Korea. So you can imagine in the United States, we're feeling very concerned that more and more countries are becoming communist, and that our worry is going to increase that South Korea will also become communist. And what we had thought might happen did happen. So we tried to build up the South Korean army because we feared there would be an invasion, and that's exactly what happened. In June of 1950, North Korea crosses over the 38th parallel line into South Korea. And its goal is to take over South Korea, reunite the peninsula as one single Korea under a communist government. So the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations after World War II, gets involved and says, we don't do this. Like, countries don't invade other countries. We don't take them over. Those are part of the provisions of the United Nations. And so it asks for an immediate ceasefire. However, the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations because they would not allow China into its governing body. And so the Soviet Union wasn't there to make a decision about how the United Nations was asking for a ceasefire. And the Soviet Union continued to back North Korea in its invasion, or supported North Korea's invasion into the South. So now the United States is faced with a really tough decision. What do? Do we support South Korea and try to keep it a democratic country, or do we stay out of it? And so on June 27th, the United Nations Security Council labeled North Korea as an aggressor, even though the Soviet Union resisted. They were boycotting the UN, so they didn't get to stop the UN from doing this. And they offered their support to South Korea. And the United States then, as a member of the United Nations, they sponsored what they called a police action. So technically, the United States is not getting involved in a war, even though we call it the Korean War. It's really a United Nations police action. So the United States will be able to send money and troops to Korea without the authorization of Congress. Congress does not have to vote and approve the United States going to war, because technically this isn't a war. So the United States forces are sent into South Korea under the direction of General MacArthur, who was a former World War II general, and other countries are going to send their money and support as well. However, the reality is nobody is going to give the same amount of support that the United States did. So there is significant backing from the United States as far as our military and financially. Other countries will send some support, but really when we talk about fighting in the Korean War, it is the majority United States forces that are fighting alongside South Korean forces. So what you are going to do for your assignment to go along with this is I want you to look at why. The United States could have stayed out of it. We could have not gotten involved. We didn't have to risk American lives fighting on the Korean Peninsula. Many people are concerned about this. The last war, World War II, had just ended 5 years prior, and now we're investing our military into another very lethal conflict. So there's got to be some good reasons why the United States thinks that it's important to protect South Korea from North Korea or from communism. So there are two readings that I want you to look at. The first one is a statement by President Truman. So Truman is going to give a speech where he explains his rationale for why he thinks the United States should get involved. I would like you to write a couple of bullet points, like 4 or 5 bullet points that explain his reasoning, like 4 would be fine, of why he thinks it's important for the United States to get involved. What are some of the things that he's thinking about as far as not just for South Korea directly, but for the world? You know, how does this really relate to the United States position and message that we're sending to the rest of the world if we act versus we don't act? And then if you look at the textbook reading, there are 2 pages I want you to read, pages 484 to 485. You do not have to read the whole section, just read those pages where it talks about the beginning of the war and look at what the textbook is saying. So when we look at a secondary source and say, okay, when we reflect back on it, what are some of the reasons that they have? And again, like 4 reasons, even 3 to 4 reasons would be fine. I know I keep reducing it, but just find like some bullet pointed reasons why each of these 2 sources, one primary source and one secondary source, why are they saying the United States decides to get involved in this conflict? Because we didn't have to. We choose to. And there's got to be a reason why we're choosing to send our soldiers in to back South Korea. Okay, as always, let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to help. Feel free to send me an email or reach out. You can text me, and I will help as best as I can. Talk to you guys soon.